Title: At 62, the tragedy of Jodie Foster is beyond heartbreaking. In a world where time moves forward with predictable certainty, there are stories that unfold so slowly and so quietly that most people don't even notice the weight they carry. Today, we look at one such story, one that is stretched across decades, layered with pressure, responsibility, silence, and consequences. It is the long, gradual, and deeply personal tragedy of Jodie Foster, a tragedy that seems almost invisible, yet when examined closely, becomes undeniably heartbreaking. Script Part 1. When we speak about Jodie Foster, most people remember brilliance. They remember the young prodigy, the girl who began her journey in commercials before she even knew how to spell her own name. They remember the thoughtful actress who grew into one of Hollywood's most respected figures. But very few pause to consider the slow, steady toll that such a life takes. And now, at 62, as people look back at her long career, a different picture begins to appear. One filled not only with success, but with decades of emotional fatigue, public scrutiny, and private burdens. From the beginning, Jodie's life moved at a pace that was not natural for a child. At just 3 years old, she was already working. Cameras were pointed at her, scripts were handed to her, and expectations were built around her. And this wasn't the kind of pressure that stayed in the background. It was a constant daily responsibility. Day after day, she found herself shaped not by childhood experiences, but by the rigid schedules of an industry that rarely stops long enough to ask how a child truly feels. By the time she reached 12, the world knew her name. Audiences praised her performance in Taxi Driver, critics celebrated her talent, and grown adults admired her discipline. But behind all this praise stood the reality that she had barely lived a normal day in her life. There were no casual school afternoons, no slow weekends spent with friends, no careless teenage mistakes. Everything she did was monitored, evaluated, and expected to be perfect. As she continued to grow, the life around her remained strangely structured. Hollywood celebrated her maturity, yet that same maturity kept her from experiencing the small freedoms that most people take for granted. Even the most basic experiences, like deciding who to trust, how to relax, or how to make personal choices, became unusually complicated. Fame does not create room for uncertainty. And for Jodie, uncertainty was something she rarely had time for. Now, at 62, when her career is examined from a distance, all these pieces begin to form a pattern. The loneliness of childhood, the pressure of early fame, the silence surrounding her private life, and the expectations that followed her everywhere. All of these formed the layers of a tragedy that many never noticed. One of the earliest signs of this slow, creeping tragedy appeared when she became the target of an obsession that would change her life forever. Although this event is discussed publicly in terms of political impact and security failures, very few people understand the emotional weight it placed on her shoulders. A teenager, barely beginning adulthood, suddenly found herself connected to a violent act that she had nothing to do with. For most people, such a situation would be unimaginable, but for Jodie, it was something she was expected to endure quietly, professionally, and without visible reaction. The world kept watching her, waiting to see how she would behave. Every interview was analyzed, every expression was interpreted, and the pressure to remain composed never went away. As she moved into adulthood, Jodie should have been able to create distance between herself and the trauma she never asked for. But fame does not offer distance. It offers magnification. It turns every decision into a headline and every silence into speculation. So instead of healing openly, she had to heal privately, behind closed doors, without the emotional support that ordinary people take for granted. This constant internal weight shaped her choices, her career, and her relationships. It influenced how she spoke, how she appeared in public, and how she navigated personal boundaries. And slowly, as the years passed, people began to notice a kind of cautiousness in her, a quietness, a distance, a reserved tone that made her seem controlled, composed, and always careful. This is where the tragedy becomes clearer, because the very qualities people admired, her discipline, her seriousness, her professionalism, were also signs of something else. Signs of someone who had spent a lifetime protecting herself. Signs of someone who had learned far too early that being open was dangerous. And signs of a woman who had lived decades under a pressure that never belonged to her. By the time she entered her 40s and 50s, she had become a symbol of artistic excellence, but behind that excellence was exhaustion. The exhaustion of always being reasonable, always being intelligent, always being calm. These traits, so heavily praised by the public, also prevented her from expressing vulnerability in the way most people do. And now, at 62, when she looks back on her life, she does so with the weight of all those years. The weight of being watched, being judged, and being responsible far too early. Her legacy is undeniable. Her achievements are remarkable. But the emotional cost behind those achievements tells a very different story. A quiet tragedy. A slow, invisible heartbreak. One that has followed her for decades and continues, even now, to define the way she moves through the world. This is not the tragedy of scandal or downfall. It is the tragedy of a lifetime spent under pressure, silence, control, and expectation. And that is what makes it so heartbreaking, because it is not loud or obvious. It is hidden in the years, in the choices, and in the quiet spaces between her public appearances. And that silent weight is only just beginning to be understood.
Sometimes, the most heartbreaking stories are not the loud ones. They are the ones that unfold quietly, without drama, without noise, and without any sudden moment of collapse. They are the stories that stretch over decades, becoming heavier and heavier, until the weight becomes almost invisible. Today, we look at one such story, the long, slow, and deeply sad tragedy of Jodie Foster. At 62, her life reflects a heartbreak that most people never noticed, yet it has been there all along, quietly shaping the woman the world sees today. To understand the tragedy of Jodie Foster, we have to begin at the very start of her unusual journey. Unlike most children, Jodie did not wake up one morning and decide to become an actress. She did not pursue fame, nor did she enter the entertainment world with ambition or dreams. Instead, she was placed there, gently, quietly, but very early. At the age of 3, she became part of an industry she could not understand. While other children learned to run, draw, or play in the sand, Jodie learned how to face a camera. The world found this remarkable. Here was a child who could memorize lines, deliver expressions, and behave more calmly than many adults. But behind this praise was a simple truth. Jodie was growing up without actually growing up. Her days were scheduled, her emotions monitored, and her behavior shaped by the expectations of directors, producers, and audiences who saw her not as a child, but as a talented product. As she grew older, the pressure only increased. By the age of 12, she found herself in one of the most controversial films in American cinema. Taxi Driver became the turning point of her career, but it was also the beginning of her lifelong burden. Audiences admired her maturity, her intelligence, her composure, but she was still a child. One asked to portray a life far darker, more disturbing, and more psychologically complex than anything she had experienced. People celebrated her performance, but very few asked how she felt. Very few wondered what it meant for a 12-year-old to carry such emotional weight, to work in such an adult world, and to be praised not for being young, but for being old beyond her years. This was the first silent wound. As the years passed, the world saw Jodie as a symbol of intelligence and discipline. She attended Yale, mastered her craft, and maintained a level of privacy that made her seem strong and controlled. But privacy is often misunderstood. For Jodie, privacy was not a preference. It was a necessity. It was a shield, a quiet form of survival in a world that had watched her for far too long. And then, at just 18 years old, she became the unwilling center of a national crisis. A young man, obsessed with her character in Taxi Driver, attempted to assassinate the President of the United States, claiming he did it to impress her. Overnight, Jodie became part of a story she never chose. Reporters followed her. Cameras targeted her. Every word she said, every word she didn't say, was analyzed. She was not a politician, not a public official, not someone responsible for the actions of strangers. Yet she bore the emotional impact of the event with a silence that was almost painful. She was barely an adult, yet she had to behave with more restraint, more composure, and more professionalism than people twice her age. This was the second silent wound. As Jodie continued to build her career, people admired her quiet nature. They praised her for being reserved, intelligent, private. But those traits, which looked like strength from the outside, were in many ways symptoms of the life she had lived. A life that taught her, from childhood, that opening up was dangerous, that attention was unsafe, that being too visible could lead to consequences she never asked for. Years turned into decades, film after film, interview after interview, red carpet after red carpet. Each appearance polished, calm, thoughtful. But with each passing year, the emotional toll became clearer. The barriers around her grew stronger. The distance between her and the public grew wider. The world saw her success, but they never truly saw the exhaustion underneath them. Now, at 62, Jodie Foster stands as one of the most respected figures in Hollywood. She is admired, celebrated, and acknowledged for her talent and intelligence. But the tragedy of her life is not found in scandal or downfall. It is found in the quiet, steady burden she has carried since childhood. The burden of being watched. The burden of being misunderstood. The burden of being connected to events she never caused. The burden of losing a normal life long before she even had the chance to build one. Today, when people look back at her life, they see success. But beneath that success lies a heartbreaking truth. Jodie Foster has lived a life defined not by freedom, but by control. Not by childhood innocence, but by adult responsibility. Not by personal choices, but by circumstances she never chose. A tragedy that never exploded. A tragedy that never made headlines. A tragedy that simply grew quietly, slowly, and invisibly. And it continues even now.
As Jodie Foster entered her 30s, many expected her life to finally settle, to finally become balanced, to finally allow her the space to breathe after the pressures of her youth. But life rarely follows such convenient expectations. The external world saw her success and assumed it meant stability. They saw her awards and assumed it meant happiness. They saw her intelligence and assumed it meant strength. But what the world saw was only the surface of a life that had been shaped by decades of quiet trauma. Success does not erase childhood burdens, it only hides them. And for Jodie Foster, success became another layer of armor she had to wear. Armor that looked impressive from the outside, but felt unbearably heavy from the inside. Throughout her 30s and 40s, she continued working at a steady pace. She chose roles carefully, directed films, and maintained a level of professionalism that made her appear unshakable. But that professionalism came at a cost. It kept her from expressing vulnerability. It kept her from slowing down. It kept her from admitting even to herself that the emotional fatigue of her early years had never truly left. People admired her calmness. They admired her quiet intelligence. They admired her ability to stay composed in interviews. But they rarely questioned why she was so composed. They didn't ask what it feels like to spend your entire life being careful, to measure every phrase, to plan every expression. to live decades behind a controlled exterior because losing control even once could open a door you can never close again. It was during this stage of life that Jodie began to understand the long-term consequences of her early fame. Not the financial consequences, not the professional ones, but the emotional ones. She began to realize how difficult it was to trust people, how difficult it was to relax, how difficult it was to form connections without fear, without caution, without the old instinct to protect herself from whatever might go wrong. This was the tragedy that most people never saw. The slow realization that a life spent being composed is a life where emotional freedom becomes impossible. The world around her continued to evolve. New actors entered the industry, new voices rose, and Hollywood changed dramatically. But Jodie remained the same, calm, thoughtful, reserved, still admired, still respected, and still quietly carrying the emotional weight that few ever acknowledged. As she moved into her 50s, the contrast between her public image and her private reality grew even sharper. Publicly, she was celebrated for her timeless talent and her ability to choose meaningful roles. But privately, the years of emotional restraint had created a sense of isolation that was difficult to escape. Many people assume that isolation is loud, dramatic, or obvious, but the type of isolation Jodie carried was quiet. It was the kind that develops slowly as small decisions accumulate. The decision to keep certain experiences private, the decision to avoid situations that feel exposing, the decision to remain guarded even around people who mean well. These decisions are subtle. They do not feel tragic at first. But as years pass, they create a life where vulnerability feels dangerous, where openness feels impossible, and where true emotional closeness becomes rare. This is the tragedy of a quiet life, one that is full of accomplishments, yet starved of emotional rest. Even as she continued to work, earning more awards and maintaining her reputation as one of the most respected actresses in the industry, there was always a distance surrounding her, a distance that people often misinterpreted as confidence or independence. But in reality, it was the natural result of living an entire life under the pressure of being watched, judged, and misunderstood. And then, as she began nearing her 60s, another layer of tragedy became visible, not through scandal, not through controversy, but through reflection. When a person reaches this stage of life, they naturally look back. They evaluate their journey. They compare what they gained with what they lost. They ask themselves what their life truly meant and whether it gave them what they hoped it would. For Jodie Foster, this reflection was not simple.